Thank you. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here. And I know we're probably all a bit sleepy after lunch, so hopefully I won't contribute to that too much further, putting you all asleep. But so, as it's been mentioned a couple times in some of the earlier presentations, FDA did publish a 5-year plan in September. So what I'd like to spend most of my time here this afternoon is just to provide you a little bit more background and provide a bit of an overview of what's in that plan. So that's what I primarily want to focus on. But before turning to that, I feel like we do need to sort of recognize the progress that has been made to date, which I think is significant. So I just want to take a few minutes just to review, although many of you are already very familiar with this, but maybe some are not. But again, I think it is important to take stock of sort of what we've already accomplished, as a sort of precursor to diving in onto what the next steps may be. Obviously, already mentioned a number of times, but I just put this slide in here just to keep sending home the message that this is a One Health issue, and we continue to try to approach this from a One Health issue, which means looking at use of antibiotics in all sectors across all species, including the human species and pet animals, and I think that's something that we're also focusing on as we look at what we see as next steps, and look at some areas where perhaps we haven't been focused as much in the past. So again, as just revisiting kind of where we've been, I think one of the key focuses of and I think it was Dr. Wagstrom that mentioned the terminology of judicious versus responsible versus stewardship, and again, that terminology probably has evolved a bit over time. Going back to when we really started down this path of developing Guidance 209 and 213, I think judicious use was really the term in vogue at that time. I think our terminology has evolved a bit. But nonetheless, I think the key focus at that time as part of that strategy was to look particularly at medically important antibiotics and make sure that we're only using them when they're really needed, and to address animal health needs, and then make sure that those products have the appropriate veterinary oversight. The focus of that effort then was, and the strategy for implementing it was outlined in Guidance 213, which has been referenced. That guidance set a target date of January 2017 to get those two key changes made, which is eliminate uses that are not necessary for addressing animal health, i.e. production or growth promotion uses, and to shift the feed and water uses of these products from what was then over-the-counter availability to availability that required a veterinarian, and that's either as prescription status for the water products or veterinary feed directive status for the drugs used in the feed. And that was really the target of what was basically a 3-year effort initiated in 2013, completed in January of 2017. Obviously, a core element of what we were doing as part of that effort was bringing the veterinarian in, making sure that we're reinforcing the role of the veterinarian in terms of antibiotic use, and in particular with the use of these medically important antibiotics. Understanding that from a practical standpoint, veterinarians can't physically, literally administer antibiotics to each and every animal that's under their care or their supervision, but that the veterinarian does certainly play an important role in consulting with and providing advice to farmers and ranchers across the country in helping them make the best decisions in terms of what antibiotics to use when and for how long and those kinds of things. So that was really the key focus, was to make sure that we sort of more formalize that role of the veterinarian. Oops. So again, the focus was not on necessarily all antimicrobials, but from a risk perspective, medically important ones. Now, in the end, unfortunately, many of the products that we do rely on for animal health are also used in human medicines, which obviously makes this a very challenging issue because of that sort of shared use between both humans and animals. But again, it was really focused on those products, given the connection or the concern that use in animals to some degree is contributing to the overall issue of concern, which has a human health impact, as well as loss of effectiveness of those products in animals. And so that was really what we focused on was the medically important ones, and that was something that we had already defined through an appendix or through a guidance that FDA previously issued back in 2003. And I'll come back to this because this is actually one of the things on our to-do list in the plan that I'll talk about. So veterinary feed directive, just 2 seconds on this, is the fact that for some this may be sort of an unusual concept in the sense before we implemented all these changes in 2017, there were very few products that were actually designated as veterinary feed directive. Now there are many products designated feed directive, so essentially it's the corollary of prescription status in the sense that any drug that's intended to be used and administered through feed that is determined to require the oversight of a veterinarian by law needs to be designated as a veterinary feed directive as opposed to prescription. It doesn't just limit, this is not just limited to antibiotics, it's basically to any animal drug. It just so happens we only have antibiotics right now that are approved as veterinary feed directives. So understanding the importance of this whole framework to this, that's why part of the whole strategy was updating the VFD rule in terms of setting the stage for those changes. And that was part of the overall strategy, was to update the regulations to make them more streamlined. That was done in 2015 in advance of all the changes actually going into effect in 2017. So when you look at exactly what was accomplished, then again, the new VFD regulation actually went into effect in 2015, really in advance of really much of the changes actually happening. And the real changes, all the products really changed in 2017. That was by design, trying to coordinate it. So we had a sort of uniform shifting of products in terms of their marketing status. And so effective to January 1, 2017, all medically important antibiotics that are used in animal feed or drinking water require now a prescription or a VFD. There are no longer it's no longer legal to use any medically important antibiotics for growth promotion purposes. And that was, I think, a very significant accomplishment. And I think here's just summarizing the scope of the changes, which we're talking about a fairly large number of products. I think at the outset we had roughly about the 25 drug sponsors, companies that had affected products. So there was a lot of companies that basically came on board, and we were very pleased to see the cooperation we did get from the pharmaceutical industry to work with us to get all these changes made. And so in the end, we got 100%. All the products that were affected by this, all 292 were one way or the other aligned. And as you can see here, some of those products were withdrawn. And in most of those cases, there were products that, for whatever reason, were not actually being actively marketed. And then you can see the breakdown, which was sort of half and half in terms of those that were feed or water products. And in the end, about 30 products that had growth promotion uses, those growth promotion uses were removed. So I think those were really significant changes. The changes that were made were voluntary in the sense that the pharmaceutical companies voluntarily agreed to work with FDA to make those changes. Understanding, though, that downstream, the end users of these products, veterinarians, producers, farmers, this really isn't voluntary from their perspective in the sense that now that these products have been revised, they now have an obligation to use them that way and also to seek the consultation with a veterinarian in order to access and use these products. So that's a big change in terms of really shifting significantly the sort of framework under which these products have been used. Particularly the veterinary oversight shift really has changed the dynamic in terms of, again, distribution and use of these products. So with that in mind, I think that's all. We're all should be sort of thankful for the work that was done in terms of getting these changes made. There were a lot of groups that worked hard to get the information out to all those who were affected to get this done in an effective way. I'd love to be able to say that we solved the problem and we can all move on to other things, but there are more challenges ahead of us. I think there's more work we need to do to further address this issue, and I think in large part the plan that I'm going to speak about here is an extension of this. Our view is We want to continue to build on the success of this effort, continue to work in a collaborative way with all affected stakeholders to sort of look at what are some of the additional things we could do to improve how we're using these antibiotics, again, with the goal of helping to slow down resistance and preserve their effectiveness for both humans and animals. So with that in mind, I think, just touching again on what we see as next steps, which is really what was encapsulated in this 5-year plan that we published in September. And so it's really meant as a high-level sort of roadmap of what we see ahead of us. Frankly, we understand that there's some things that are listed in here that may be of concern to some folks in terms of, how are we going to accomplish this? But I think our view was, rather than just sort of trickle out sort of one thing after the other in terms of what is coming next, our view was that it might be better, just to list out, here are the things we see on the horizon that we see as important issues to deal with. Let's just lay it out there on the table so we can begin working on sort of coming up with strategies of how can we effectively address these issues in collaboration with all the affected stakeholders. Again, sort of using a similar playbook that we used for the 213-209 effort. I would say that this is presented as a 5-year plan, but I would say that it's not our expectation necessarily that we're going to complete every action item in this plan. I think when I counted, there's 3 main goals, there's 3 objectives under each goal, and there's a total of about 32 individual action items. We don't necessarily expect that we're going to complete, be able to check off we've completed and resolved every one of those 32 action items in 5 years. It is our goal, though, to focus on those issues and initiate action and develop plans and strategies for how to address those issues. And understand that it's a living document. What we know now, we may change in 2 or 3 years as we learn more, and if we think differently about certain elements of the plan, we should step back and look at it and revise it as necessary. So I would just say that up front, that I think it's again meant to be a high-level roadmap, but can evolve as we see necessary and based on what science tells us and what we learn down the road as we proceed. It is generally broken down into sort of phase 1, phase 2, just sort of what we're trying to focus on initially in the first half and what we're going to sort of direct towards the end of that. And partly it's just because we have limited resources, but we recognize everybody else has limited resources to be able to focus on all these different activities. So again, there's three main goals, and just from an overview, the 3 main areas are: 1, what are there additional things we can do relative to the products themselves, the antimicrobial products, how they're labeled, the use conditions that they're approved under. This is clearly the one that FDA has sort of the most direct responsibility for, given that we're the agency that's responsible for approving, safe these products. And so this is an area that sort of, I think we would say we have the most sort of direct influence over. And again, we've already made a lot of progress here in terms of the updates that have been made for the feed and water products. But again, it's looking at those products and what else can we do there. Second is on stewardship, really at the level of at the veterinarian. Again, a little bit more at arm's length from FDA, clearly an area where many stakeholders and many other organizations have an important role to play. So we're just looking at a perspective of what can FDA do to try to help, support getting information out to veterinarians and producers and help support stewardship, at the veterinary and farm level. And then third is data, and what more can we do to enhance the information we have so we can better assess the progress we're making, and also be able to assess, are we taking the right steps? Are we moving in the right direction? Do we need to adjust what we're doing? And can we effectively tell our story in terms of, are we making a difference? I think we need better information to be able to do that. So I'm not going to attempt to go through all 32 action items. I would definitely probably put you to sleep by the end of that 32. So I'm just going to highlight the sort of main objectives and then touch on a few examples of the action items. So under the first goal, again, this is the sort of product-oriented goal. One area is the products for food animals. Are there additional things we need to do there? Obviously, we've already done a number of changes. What else do we need to do for food animals? Second big area here is, is really getting to this more One Health idea. Have we really thrown the net, and are we addressing all the issues? And I think an area that we've not focused much on, perhaps as we should, is the companion animal sector, and I think that's another area that we need to explore. Again, not that we've set any particular plan in terms of what we need to do in that arena, but other than highlight the fact that we do need to look at that sector and get a better understanding what are the risks associated with that, and are there things we should be doing in terms of fostering good antimicrobial stewardship in that sector. We can't say this is a One Health sort of effort if we're not looking at all the sectors. And then the third area related to products is, are there things we can do to encourage new products, alternative products, because that's always an important part of this. So I'm just going to hit on a couple examples that sort of fall in this sort of product category. One, as I alluded to it earlier, foundational to a lot of what we've been doing is trying to focus on those antibiotics those antimicrobials that we consider medically important. That's based on a ranking that we published 15 years ago, so 2003. I think we've known for time that that's not static, that we need to make sure it reflects current science and current medical practice. And I think so that's something we need to do, is to look at that listing and make sure it reflects current thinking. So one of the action items in here is to revisit this Appendix A of Guidance 152, which is the appendix itself is essentially a list of antimicrobial drugs and drug classes that's ranked according to their importance to human medicine. And so that's sort of what defines what is considered medically important. So that's something that we're working on. I think, again, we expect that we'll be going through a broad public input process for that in terms of putting out a draft and looking at the opportunity potentially of having some form of public meeting or other venue for getting public input. So that's one important action item, and our goal is to at least initiate some public input on this, hopefully in 2019. Second, and this has been mentioned, I think we've accomplished already getting all the feed and water uses of medically important antimicrobials under veterinary oversight. That's by far the vast majority. If you just look at sales volume of medically important antimicrobials, roughly 95% of sales volume is accounted for by the feed and water products. So those are all under veterinary oversight now. So something less than 5%, and it's actually less than 5% because we know that we already have some of the other dosage forms already prescription, but there are something less than 5% are still available as over-the-counter. Some injectable products, some oral dosage forms, some intramammaries, for example, that are OTC, and I think we need, I think consistent with where we've already moved on this, that we need to bring those products under veterinary oversight as well. Again, we're looking at a similar strategy of developing a sort of a plan for doing that. We've set a target for getting at least a draft of that plan by the end of fiscal year 2019, so end of September 2019. We expect to be, again, engaging more with the industry on sort of developing that plan, and then, of course, there will be an opportunity for public comment on that before we actually implement it. And like we did with Guidance 213, we'll likely lay out a more specific timeline for here are the products that need to be revised, and set out a timeline and target date for getting that accomplished. Another area which I would say is probably one of the most, if not most, challenging issues in the overall plan is addressing this question around duration of use. We've actually already initiated some public discourse on this issue. We published an announcement back in 2016 seeking public comment on this issue. So we've already gotten a fair amount of comment that we're looking at on sort of how to approach that. And again, I think there's a number of things to take into account with this, probably not the least of which that is an important step that's already been made is that these products are now at least under veterinary oversight, whereas they were before OTC. So I think now we need to be also looking at this from the perspective of these are now products that are administered under the oversight of a veterinarian. many, if not most of these products were originally approved as over-the-counter products. So the labeling of those products was largely designed around the layperson as the audience. So I think that's another factor, but again, there's a lot to sort through on this issue in terms of how to sort of get to where we need to be in terms of aligning these products to sort of better marry up with what our current thinking is on with regard to responsible use or judicious use or good stewardship. And I think that again, taking into account too the vendor oversight component of that. On this one, since again a significant amount of work I think still needs to go into sort of figuring out and mapping out a plan for this, we've set a target date for a draft plan on this initiative by the end of 2020, so that's September of 2020. Again, similarly, we are looking to work with affected stakeholders on getting further input as we develop the draft plan, and then we'll have it out for public comment again when we hit our target date of September 2020. Journey to goal 2, again, which is really focused more on sort of education and outreach in terms of supporting stewardship, as well as, so in this area, I think there's 3 areas that we've sort of outlined in terms of objectives. One is, again, what more can we do in terms of outreach and education? We're supporting other organizations that deliver such outreach and education. I think there's some elements for us in terms of making sure our compliance programs are up to date and that we're making sure that we're adequately and sort of assuring compliance with any relevant programs, for example, via the VFD. And then the third area is really an international one where there's clearly a lot of activity in the national arena related to antimicrobial use and antimicrobial stewardship that we need to stay engaged in. Examples here under this goal 2, clearly this is an area where I think we're looking to collaborate. I mean, FDA is not primarily by any means an educational agency, but we certainly are looking for opportunities to work with other federal agencies as well as other organizations, veterinary producer organizations, to help disseminate information. We have, for example, worked in the past with our colleagues at USDA, who if you've not seen some of the educational modules that are out as part of APHIS's accreditation program, I would, it's good to take a look at those. I think those are good examples where we've got, information out there for veterinarians as well as others who are accessing that information on antimicrobial use as well as the VFD process. And it was talked about earlier, Dr. Costin mentioned the AVMA Committee on Antimicrobials, which is an important place where we can collaborate with with the veterinary community. As far as compliance, I think, again, I mentioned the VFD program. Of the whole initiative, again, that's obviously the one element of the strategy that to date that sort of has a regulatory component to it, which is the veterinary feed directive, which there are a set of requirements associated with that apply to veterinarians, feed mill operators, as well as producers. We have incorporated inspectional activities as part of some of our ongoing inspections, and that's something that we're still working on. We do expect, and we did run a pilot, sort of testing out some tools for doing inspections, particularly in feed mills, with some follow-up to veterinarians and farms related to VFD use. We are shooting for putting together a summary report on sort of what we've learned over the last couple of years from that inspectional program. We're hoping to get that out early in 2019. And then goal 3, 3 objectives under goal 3 related to enhancing data collection, sort of simply falling into sort of 3 areas. One, what can we do to sort of enhance, fill a gap with regard to collecting better information on actual drug use? What more can we do to enhance the data that's being collected on resistance? And third, what can we do to take that data and better utilize that data, summarize that data, communicate that data, share data as necessary across different partners. So some examples here, I think, as you probably know, we already have been for some time, since 2009, been collecting data on antimicrobial drug sales in food-producing animals. That's required by law. So drug companies are required to report that to us on an annual basis. We are required to report out a summary of that. While sales data has value in terms of helping us sort of understand sort of what the sort of general trends in terms of where different product types or drug classes are being used and at sort of relative magnitudes, we do understand limitations with sales data. It is what is entering distribution channels does not necessarily tell us what's actually being used, nor does it give us much granularity about the sort of why these products are being used. And so there's really a gap here in terms of better understanding actual use. And I think that's one of the things we've been trying to work on is what are different mechanisms for being able to collect that kind of information, in a practical way and in a way that adequately protects confidential information and other concerns about that such data sharing. Obviously, on the veterinary sector, we have the challenge that we have very limited infrastructure that exists today in terms of being able to tap into this kind of information. Clearly not, very different from the human healthcare setting. So I think one of the things that we have been working on is some pilot studies. We're in our third year of funding on those studies. There's 2 ongoing projects that are being funded under these cooperative agreements. One addressing both feedlot and dairy, the other addressing poultry and swine. These again, we're in their third year of funding now. We do hope to be seeing data from those here and expect to be including presenting some summary information or reports back on that early next year. So I think this will hopefully provide us. I think we're encouraged by sort of progress that's been made to date in terms of getting those methodologies up and running. And again, the intent here was to gather information on both methodologies as well as get an initial snapshot of some data in terms of what's actually happening at the farm level. There's also, with regard to our NARMS program, which is a National Antimicrobial Resistance Monitoring System, there's a number of enhancements that we're working on there, in large part aligned with some key recommendations we got from an FDA Science Board review that was done a year or 2 ago on the NARMS program. Again, trying to expand testing and improve the representativeness of the data that's captured by the NARMS program. And then this is an important area where we are, again, understanding one of the big challenges ahead of us is sort of communicating to all stakeholders and to the public and being able to provide evidence or assess progress that's being made in terms of the efforts that we're making. And how do we best assess and measure that? A really challenging issue to tackle. Certainly there's a lot of emphasis being placed on the quantity of antibiotics that are being used. And certainly that is something that we have to pay attention to, but it's our belief, I think, that alone is not sufficient. It doesn't give us a full understanding of what is a very complex area. So, our view, and I think we held a public meeting on this issue actually 2015, so 3 years ago, laying out sort of this issue and how to approach it. And I think we continue to believe what we believe then, that we need to take a more comprehensive approach in terms of how we're looking at the issue, and that assessing this really at this point can't be tied to one particular data point or data stream, that we need to look at a more comprehensive set. So one of our goals for next year is to tap into what are all the information that's available to begin to assess progress being made in terms of I think the goal being not necessarily just to limit or reduce quantity for the sake of reducing quantity, but to move towards our goal of making sure that antibiotics are being used according to good stewardship principles across the veterinary sectors. And to do that, we think we need to look at not only just sales data, use data, resistance data, understanding how that relates to animal health patterns, animal demographics, and other information that I think provides the necessary context to better assess progress being made on stewardship. And so, in summary, I think the message, I think, is that I think we've made a lot of progress. I think the efforts under Guidance 209-213 were a huge success in terms of the collaborative effort that went into that, and I think it shows that when we do make an effort to collaborate, we can accomplish some pretty significant things. Our hope is to continue to move along that same vein and try to make additional progress where additional changes need to be made, or expand into other areas where we've not paid enough focus on. But again, I think it does require a combined effort of many stakeholders contributing to make progress, and we're committed to continuing down that same path of collaboration, and look forward to working with all those in this room and others as we move forward with this next 5 years. So thank you very much.